The Man Without a Shadow. A Tale of the Wild West. Part 1. The Dust That Remembered. The town of Caldera Wells had a way of swallowing men whole. It sat in the bowl of a dead valley, ringed on three sides by red mesa walls that turned the color of dried blood at sunset. The fourth side opened onto a flat expanse of alkali flats where nothing grew except the occasional clump of gray brittle bush and the kind of silence that felt like it had weight. The town itself was not much. A main street wide enough for two wagons to pass without touching. A saloon called the Broken Spur. A livery. A general store. A small church whose white paint had long since blistered away in the relentless sun. And maybe 40 souls who had either been too stubborn or too broken to leave. The sheriff had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 years past, and no one had seen fit to replace him. In a place like Caldera Wells, the law was whatever the strongest man decided it was on any given morning. That was the world into which Cole Harrow rode on a Tuesday in the deep heat of August, when the air itself seemed reluctant to move. He came from the north, down the cut between the mesas, his horse a pale gray gelding that moved with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had covered a great many miles and expected to cover a great many more. The man on its back was lean in the way that long years of hard country make a man lean, not the leanness of hunger, but the leanness of everything unnecessary having been stripped away. His coat was the color of old ash. His hat was pulled low. His face, what could be seen of it, was angular and still, like a piece of country itself, creased by sun and wind, weathered to something that was almost not a human face anymore, almost a landscape. He rode in around midday, when the sun stood directly overhead, and the shadows of every man, every horse, every building in Caldera Wells were compressed to small dark pools, directly beneath their owners, like frightened animals hiding from the heat. The few people on the street watched him come in. A man named Dalt Ferris, who spent most of his days on the porch of the general store, whittling things that served no purpose, squinted at the stranger and noted something that he would mention to his wife that evening, and that his wife would mention to 3 other women by the following morning. The stranger had no shadow. Dalt Ferris rubbed his eyes. He looked at the stranger's horse. The gray gelding cast a small, neat shadow beneath its hooves, right and proper. He looked at the ground around the stranger. Nothing, just the pale dust of the street, unmarked, as though the man were made of glass, as though the sun passed straight through him and came out the other side undiminished. Dalt Ferris set down his whittling and said nothing. He was a practical man. Practical men in Caldera Wells had learned that some things were better left unmentioned, at least until they had been properly understood. And some things, he suspected, were better left unmentioned altogether. The stranger rode to the livery, dismounted, arranged for the care of his horse, and walked to the Broken Spur. He walked the way men who carry guns walk in country like that, not with swagger, not with hurry, but with the careful, measured tread of someone who is always aware of the distance between himself and every other person in his vicinity. He sat at the bar and ordered whiskey. The barkeep, a thick-armed man named Ira, who had once been a miner, and before that a soldier, and before that a boy in Ohio who had wanted nothing more complicated from life than a small farm and a quiet wife, poured the whiskey and tried not to stare at the space where the man's shadow should have been on the floor. "Passing through?" Ira asked, because it was the kind of question you asked. "Maybe," the stranger said. His voice was low and even. It had the quality of water moving under ice. Present, purposeful, but with something hidden beneath the surface. "Depends on what I find. What are you looking for?" The stranger turned his glass in his hand, studying the way the whiskey caught the dim light coming through the Broken Spur's single dusty window. "Man named Pruett. Solomon Pruett." Ira's face did the thing faces did when they heard that name in Caldera Wells. A certain tightening, a certain careful neutrality that was itself a kind of answer. "I might know the name," Ira said. "Most people around here do," the stranger said. He drank his whiskey in a single clean motion, set the glass down, and added, "My name is Cole Harrow." And Ira, who had heard that name too, in the way that names travel on the desert wind and arrive in small towns before the men themselves, simply nodded and refilled the glass without being asked. Part 2. The Weight of a Reputation. The story of Cole Harrow's shadow, or rather the lack of it, had traveled ahead of him the way all good stories travel, faster than the man himself, growing with each telling, acquiring details and dimensions that may or may not have been present in the original event. The version most commonly told in Caldera Wells, gathered from fragments heard in passing and assembled into something coherent by Mabel Oates, who ran the town's only boarding house and had a gift for narrative, went something like this. Cole Harrow had once been an ordinary man. He had grown up in the Texas hill country, the son of a cattle rancher, and by all accounts had been unremarkable, except for a quality that became remarkable only later, a speed with a firearm that was simply not natural. Not trained fast, not practiced fast. Something else. The kind of speed that made men who witnessed it go quiet in a way they could not articulate, as though what they had seen had touched something older than language. He had drifted west, as men of that type often did, and somewhere in the territories, the exact location shifted depending on who was telling the story, ranging from a crossroads in New Mexico to a dry riverbed in Arizona to the mouth of a canyon in Utah. He had encountered something, a figure, a presence, a proposition. The details of the arrangement were never fully specified, which was perhaps the most frightening thing about it. But the outcome was understood by everyone who heard the story. Cole Harrow had given away his shadow in exchange for something. Speed beyond human speed. Accuracy beyond human accuracy. The ability to draw and fire with a certainty that was not the certainty of skill, but the certainty of destiny, as though each bullet he fired had already arrived at its destination, before his hand had even moved. In exchange, when the sun stood in the sky and threw shadows across the ground, there was no darkness beneath Cole Harrow's feet. The light refused to acknowledge him. The world of natural things had simply, quietly, declined to recognize his presence. This was the story. Whether it was true was a question that different people in Caldera Wells answered differently. Old Josephine Reyes, who had come north from Sonora 60 years ago and who knew things about the old bargains that most people had forgotten, said it was entirely possible. Reverend Marsh, whose white church had lost its paint to the sun, said it was superstition and foolishness. Young men who had never seen anything more frightening than a cattle stampede said they didn't believe a word of it. Dalt Ferris, who had watched Cole Harrow ride into town and had seen with his own two unimpaired eyes the unmarked dust beneath the stranger's feet, did not say anything at all. Part 3. Solomon Pruett's Country. Solomon Pruett had come to the Caldera Wells region 4 years ago with a crew of 12 men and a ruthlessness that was almost architectural in its precision. It had structure, it had load-bearing walls, it had been built to last. He had established himself at the old Carver Ranch, a sprawling property in the valley's northern reaches, and had proceeded to expand his holdings by methods that were not, strictly speaking, legal, but that existed in the vast gray territory between legal and illegal that characterized much of the West in those years. He owned the water rights to 3 of the 4 seasonal springs in the valley. He had an arrangement with the territorial judge that meant lawsuits against him tended to be decided in his favor, with a speed that was either remarkable or explicable, depending on your level of cynicism. 3 men who had publicly disagreed with him had died in circumstances that were officially ruled accidents and privately understood to be otherwise. His own men numbered close to 30 now, armed and loyal in the specific way that men are loyal when loyalty is the most profitable available option. Pruett himself was a compact, well-groomed man in his 40s who dressed better than the country warranted and spoke with a soft precision that some people found charming and others found frightening. He had small, very pale eyes that seemed to be permanently calibrating something, as though he were always in the process of calculating the exact value of every person and thing in his field of vision. He was, in the understanding of Caldera Wells, not a man to cross. He was also, in the understanding of Cole Harrow, a man who had killed Cole Harrow's brother. This was the fact at the bottom of everything, the stone that the whole edifice rested on. Daniel Harrow had been a farmer in this valley, one of the small operators Pruett had systematically pressured and acquired and occasionally, when acquisition failed, eliminated. Daniel had refused to sell. Daniel had written letters to the territorial authorities that had never been answered. Daniel had been found in a dry wash 3 miles from his homestead with a bullet in his back and his horse missing, and it had been ruled a robbery gone wrong. And Solomon Pruett had sent a very correct letter of condolence to Daniel's widow. Cole Harrow had received the news 6 months later in a town 200 miles away, and had turned his pale gray horse north. Part 4. The Weight of the Shadowless. On the second evening of Cole Harrow's presence in Caldera Wells, he sat in the broken spur and was approached by a man named Cassius Webb, who was Pruett's segundo, his second in command. A tall, raw-boned man with a red beard, and the kind of steady, assured manner that came from years of being the most dangerous person in most rooms. Webb sat down across from Harrow without being invited, and put his hat on the table between them. "Mr. Pruett knows you're here," Webb said. "I'd be surprised if he didn't," Harrow said. "He'd like you to understand that, whatever grievance you imagine you have, it's best addressed by leaving this valley." Harrow looked at Webb for a long, unhurried moment. "That's not what I imagine," he said. "That's what I know." Webb leaned forward slightly. He was not, by nature, a subtle man, and the directness that followed was almost a relief. "I've seen fast men before, Harrow. Some of them were faster than me. All of them bled the same." "I'm sure they did," Harrow said. His voice was entirely without heat, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Webb stood, took his hat from the table, placed it back on his head. He looked down at the floor around Harrow's chair, where the lamplight fell on everything except the man himself. A peculiar, bright absence, a lit space with no dark counter to it. Webb's face did not change, but something moved behind his pale eyes, something uncertain that had not been there when he sat down. "Think about what I said," Webb told him. "I will," Harrow said. "I'll think about it all night." Webb left. Harrow ordered another whiskey. Around him, the other patrons of the Broken Spur were engaged in the careful project of not looking at him directly, while simultaneously being unable to look at anything else. Later that night, after Harrow had retired to his room at Mabel Oates's boarding house, old Josephine Reyes came to the Broken Spur and sat at the bar and spoke in a low voice to anyone who would listen. She had known a man like this once before, she said. Not in this country, but in the old country, down south of the border, where the old bargains were better understood. She had been a girl then, and the man had been a fighter, and he had made his arrangement with something that lived in a particular ravine, outside a particular village. And for 7 years he had been invincible, and for 7 years he had cast no shadow, and on the 8th year the thing in the ravine had come to collect. She did not say what the collection consisted of. She finished her drink and walked home through the night, her own shadow long and definite in the moonlight, trailing behind her like a faithful hound. Part 5. The Boy. Who asked the boy's name was Tomas, and he was 11 years old, and he was the son of one of the last remaining independent farmers in the valley, a Mexican-American man named Aurelio, who had thus far resisted Pruitt's pressure through a combination of stubbornness and the good fortune of having a well that Pruitt did not technically have legal grounds to claim. Tomas had the particular boldness of children who have grown up in hard country, which is a boldness that exists alongside, rather than instead of fear, and so on the morning after Cole Harrow's arrival, he followed the stranger to the edge of town, where Harrow stood looking north toward the mesa, and asked him, plainly and directly, whether it was true he had no shadow. Harrow looked down at the boy. Then he looked at the ground around his own feet, as though checking something he already knew. "Seems that way," he said. "Does it hurt?" Tomas asked. Harrow considered this with what seemed like genuine seriousness. "Not in any way you'd recognize," he said. "My abuela says that a man without a shadow has lost something he can't get back. Your abuela is probably right about most things. She says you shouldn't be afraid of you. She says men who made the old bargains are always sad, and sad men aren't as frightening as people think." Harrow was quiet for a moment. He looked north again, toward the mesa, toward the direction of the Carver Ranch, toward whatever waited for him at the end of this particular road. "Your abuela is wise," he said finally, "but tell her this. Sad men who have nothing left to lose are the most frightening men there are." Tomas thought about this. "What did you lose?" "My brother," Harrow said. "And before that, what did you trade away?" Harrow looked at the boy, and for just a moment something moved across his face that was not the careful, still terrain he usually presented to the world. Something raw and old, like a wound that had been closed but not healed. "Go home," he said, not unkindly. "Stay close to your father today." Tomas went home. He told his abuela what Harrow had said. His abuela closed her eyes and was quiet for a long time. "Pray for him," she said at last. "Pray that whatever he came here to do, he does it quickly." Part 6. The Reckoning. Cole Harrow rode out to the Carver Ranch on the third morning. He rode alone, without announcement, in the clear early light before the heat had fully settled in, when the shadows of the mesa walls were still long and dark across the valley floor, and the air tasted of something almost cool. His shadow, in those early hours when shadows were longest and most emphatic, was the only absence in a world of presences, every rock, every scrub, every fence post throwing its dark double onto the pale ground, and Cole Harrow moving through it all like a tear in the fabric, a place where the shadow world had simply refused to continue. They saw him coming from a quarter-mile out. 2 of Pruitt's men were on the gate, and they called back to the house, and by the time Harrow reached the gate, there were 6 men arranged in the yard, and Cassius Webb was among them, and behind them all, on the porch of the big house, Solomon Pruett stood with his hands in the pockets of his well-pressed coat, and watched with those calibrating pale eyes. Harrow stopped his horse at the gate. "I want to speak to Pruett," he said. "You're speaking to all of us," Webb said from the yard. "I'll speak to the man who gave the order," Harrow said. His voice was the same as it always was, flat and even, with that quality of something deep and cold moving beneath a still surface. "The rest of you are just implements." One of the 6 men in the yard made a move. It was not even a full draw. It was the beginning of a draw. The first small committed motion of a hand toward iron. And the thing happened. The thing that people who had seen Cole Harrow in action found so difficult to describe afterward. It was not that he was fast. Fast was a word for things that happened in time, things where the beginning and end were distinct points that could be narrated. What Cole Harrow did seemed to happen outside of time, or in a different layer of time, as though cause and effect had temporarily rearranged themselves in his vicinity. His gun was holstered, then it was not. Then the man in the yard was sitting down in the dust with a look of profound surprise on his face and a wound in his shoulder that would heal, given care, and Cole Harrow's gun was back where it had begun. And the whole sequence had taken perhaps the time it takes a hummingbird to beat its wings once. The yard was absolutely silent. Pruett, on the porch, had not moved, but his calibrating eyes had changed. They had been calculating value. Now they were calculating something else, something closer to distance. The distance between himself and the nearest exit, perhaps. "That was a warning," Harrow said. "The next one won't be." Webb was very still. The remaining 5 men were very still. There was a quality in the stillness that was almost religious, the stillness of people in the presence of something they do not have categories for. "What do you want?" Pruett called from the porch. His voice was still controlled. The man had nerve. Harrow gave him that. "I want you to say what you did," Harrow said, out loud, in front of your men. "Say what you did to Daniel Harrow." A long pause. The early sun moved incrementally. A hawk turned overhead, riding a thermal, and its shadow swept across the yard, across the men, across Cole Harrow, and left no mark on him. "I don't know what you're referring to," Pruett said, and Harrow dismounted. What followed lasted approximately 4 minutes, though to the men who witnessed it, it seemed both much shorter and much longer than that, the kind of duration that memory can never quite calibrate correctly, because the mind, overwhelmed, simply stops tracking time in the usual way. Pruett did not have Harrow's gift, whatever it was, whatever it had cost. He was a careful man and a smart man, and he had surrounded himself with capable men, and he had built his empire on the understanding that capability, organized correctly, was the most reliable form of power. What he had not accounted for was something that could not be organized against, something that existed in the space between organized capability and whatever Cole Harrow was. Webb drew and was disarmed without being badly hurt. 2 others drew and found their guns on the ground before they could fire them. 1 man managed to get a shot off, and the shot found nothing, as though the bullet had passed through air that happened to be shaped like a man and continued on its way, without consequence. Pruett, in the end, had run from the porch toward the back of the house, and Harrow had followed, and whatever happened in the back of the house was heard but not seen by the men in the yard. A brief, sharp exchange of voices, and then a longer silence, and then Cole Harrow walking back around the side of the house. He stopped in the yard. Webb sat in the dust, cradling his gun hand, watching. "He's alive," Harrow said. "He'll be at the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson by week's end, or I'll come back. Tell him that." Webb looked at the man standing in the bright morning sun, a man with no darkness beneath him, no echo on the ground, nothing to prove that light had even bothered to try. "What are you?" Webb said. It was not the question of an enemy. It was an older question than that. Harrow considered it. "Just a man," he said finally. "A man who made a poor trade a long time ago and has been living with it ever since." He walked to his horse, swung up into the saddle. "We all have our bargains, Webb. Mine just shows. Part 7. The Road Out." He left Caldera Wells the same way he had come in, from the north, cut between the mesas, except that he left in the late afternoon, when the shadows were long again, when every object in the valley stretched its shadow out before it like a road pointing west. Tomas watched him go from the edge of his father's farm, the pale gray horse and its rider, moving south now or east or wherever the next road led, and around the horse the normal shadows of late afternoon, long and violet-edged, and around the rider. Nothing. The boy would remember it for the rest of his life. The way Cole Harrow moved through a world of shadows without making one, like a rumor of a man, like something that had already half passed into legend, even while it was still present and visible and real. His abuela came to stand beside him. "Will he be all right?" Tomas asked. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the distant figure, growing smaller against the red wall of the mesa. "He'll do what he came here to do," she said. "He already has. But the bargain, the thing he traded." She put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "There are men who give away something to become what they need to become, and they spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of what's missing. That's not a story about the devil, mijo. That's just a story about men." Tomas thought about this. He said sad men who have nothing to lose are the most frightening kind. "Yes," his abuela said. "And the saddest thing of all is that it's true." The figure disappeared into the cut between the mesas. The last light of afternoon poured gold and red across the valley floor. The shadows of the mesa walls stretched east, long and certain and absolute, every shadow but one. And in the morning, as it always did in Caldera Wells, the desert reassembled itself around the absence. The dust of the main street showed no record of footsteps that were no longer being made. The hitching post outside the broken spur stood in its own small shadow without reference to the man who had tied his horse there. The town breathed in and breathed out, and the great indifferent silence of the land settled back into place like water filling a shape. But Dalt Ferris, on his porch, picked up his whittling and could not decide what to make. He worked the wood for a long time, turning it in his hands, and eventually he set it down and looked out at the street and thought about what he had seen. The unmarked dust, the lit ground, the man-shaped absence in the world of shadows. He thought about it for the rest of his life. He never told anyone else. Some things, he had decided, were better carried quietly. Some things were better off remaining in the country of the half-seen and half-believed, where they could do their work, whatever their work was, without the weight of too much scrutiny. The desert kept its secrets. The mesas kept their shadows. And somewhere to the north or east or south, on a road between one loss and the next, Cole Harrow rode through the world without a shadow, carrying what he had given away, carrying what had been taken, carrying all the particular weight that comes to men who have traded something permanent for something temporary and have only afterwards understood the exchange. The wind moved through the alkali flats. The brittle bush shivered. Above the valley, a hawk turned and turned in the high, hot air, and its shadow raced across the pale ground below, touching everything. Everything except the memory of a man who had passed through like a rumor of a ghost, leaving behind only the stories that towns like Caldera Wells needed to survive. Not the truth of a thing, but the shape of it, the outline, the lesson hidden inside, like a stone inside a fruit. Some men are fast because they practiced. Some men are fast because they were born to it. And some men, the old women said in the quiet after dark, are fast because they paid for it with the one thing that can never be returned. The proof, cast in light and shadow, that they were here at all.